Oh yes, and I could hear you as well. Well, not actually hear you. I could see the text. So I'm not noticeably bitter, but that might come out. It did. The whole county of Essex is described as Alan Moore's beard region, which means that I get all of the drive-by shootings and crack wars, keeping me awake at night, sort of rustling and crackling down there just under my chin. I don't know what ustream is. I would imagine that it probably wouldn't be technically possible, but oh, this is what ustream is. I've got a just. It's not that annoying being a pop culture reference. It's I've learned to live with the Simpsons episode, and it was good in many ways because it did show that that is what my muscles look like under my shirt, and I can fly. The answer to the second question is not at all. He was a charming young man, and he was probably right in terms of his own to withdraw from the project when he did. No, I liked Al. You know. What are drinking today? It's tea. It's just black tea. Black and bitter, the way I like my men. On my left hand. Wings coming out. He doesn't look like the Golden Age Flash or anything, but the one on my left hand is my lovely wedding ring that I designed myself on the back of a receipt. I'd originally asked for one big vulgar opal that I could show off to everybody, but they could only get me two tear-shaped ones, and then they couldn't figure out how to work them into a coherent design, so I did the caduceus there. How's Melinda? She's fine. She's just back from the Arctic Circle, where she got mauled by huskies, and she's very proudly wearing her tattered anorak around town, and she saw the northern lights for about half an hour. So she's finding it quite tropical here at the moment. She's probably lounging around in beachwear, probably outside. What's my current favourite word? Sesquipedalian, because it's one of those few words which refers to itself. What it actually means is having a fondness for obscure and difficult words. So sesquipedalian, that's my word for today. Why was she in the Arctic? I've got no idea. Women. 1 minute they're there, the next minute they're in the Arctic Circle. Can't wait for the Book of Magic. When can we expect that to be complete? When me and Steve have got it finished. It only happens when me and Steve are together, which only happens every few weeks. But The last time I was up there, we were working through the magical spaces section, places that you might conceivably be able to project yourself into using the kind of techniques that we're talking about. I think the last ones that we did were, what was it? We did Fairyland and a couple of the places from the Kabbalah. It's coming on at a fairly, I've got no idea when it'll be finished. We're about half to 2/3 of the way through on the Book of Magic. I shall be talking about the process, I believe, later when we get down to the actual interview. I'm presuming that this is just a sort of like a warm-up act of some description. But the licking comics pages, that's not a joke. That's actually how comics are produced, and I think that any artist worth his salt would probably agree with me upon that. Brought to light the secret team, don't know, no idea. I've certainly not been approached upon it, and we did have a certain amount of difficulty just getting the spoken word album out. There weren't a lot of people who were that eager to bring it out, given what had happened to the Christic Institute and factors like that, which I can see would be a consideration. So, yeah, I thought it was a terrific piece of work. I should love to see my story and Joyce's story back in print, but as to when and where that might happen, I've really got no idea. Do I know any other languages? No. I'm sorry, I don't. I didn't get on with them very well at school. It was like most things at school, really. I found that the way that they were taught gave me actually an aversion for them. Are there any plans for League after? Oh, Harvey, yeah, this is what we're here for, of course. Thanks to everybody out there who supported this. This is fantastic. I was completely new to the entire concept of this, but it's really gratifying to know that there are so many people out there who are prepared to chip in for a monument to somebody who was one of the most influential and wonderful comic creators, as well as a wonderful human being. So, you know, thanks to all of you, and that is sincere. Do I have fun with my work? Well, of course I do. It's yes, I mean, I wouldn't be doing it otherwise. It's an essential part of my work that I decided upon years ago, that I would just have fun with whatever I was doing, because if I wasn't, then I might as well just be in a straight office job. There'd be no point in wasting creative energy in not having fun. So I decided that whatever work I ended up taking, even if it was something that I wasn't interested in, the challenge would be to find a way of making it enjoyable. So yeah, I really, really enjoy my work. What do you think? I like Jodorowsky's work a great deal. I'm not sure what Psycho Magic is. That might have been one that I've missed. I've seen a couple of his films, and he is a very, very interesting filmmaker. And I really loved the piece that he did in Arthur, where he was talking about Leonora Carrington, who at one point was the wife of Max Ernst. She was a great, prominent woman surrealist, and there weren't very many of them. And he did a very, very moving piece about his meeting with her. So yeah, Jodorowsky, he was terrific. Probably not. No, there wouldn't be any revival of any ABC characters. That is probably a closed chapter in the past. Not to say that I didn't enjoy doing those books, but the circumstances surrounding them and the industry surrounding them are probably not a place that I'm going to be revisiting anytime soon. Carrington is amazing. Yes, she is. Any news on the return of Dodge and Logic? Well, we still want to bring it back. But life at the moment is kind of getting in the way to a degree. There's lots of other things that need paying attention to. But I know that me and Joe and Lucy are all keen, and all the contributors are all really keen to get it back up. If we can do that in some viable form that won't put me in the poorhouse, which is where I'm currently living at the moment after doing the first 9 issues of Dodge and Logic. But if we can reverse that situation and reverse my destitution, then we're looking forward to doing that at some point.
Right. Should we start with the...
Let's start with the actual questions, yeah. Okay, so...
If you start with question number 2, and then you can do... I think, is that the list of the...
Yep, okay.
15, is it?
So you don't want me to start with number 1?
No.
All right.
I think, is that the top?
Okay.
Is that the top? Yeah.
So, talking about Harvey's work and how I relate to it, any particular story that struck me specifically? I mean, so much of what Harvey did was incredible. I find it difficult to remember a piece by Harvey that wasn't affecting in some way. But as for pieces that particularly stand out, most recently, I think that the Cleveland story that he did, that was perhaps the most accomplished and soulful piece that Harvey has ever done. I was immensely impressed by that. For somebody to be talking about their home location in all of that detail, I love that stuff. That is wonderful. And from back in the American Splendor days, there's always one piece which I particularly remember. It had just got Harvey on a hot day going into the kitchen, and he gets one of those little metallic sachet things of lemonade concentrate, squeezes it into a glass, turns on the tap, and you can see the water splashing down into the glass and filling it up, and then he stirs it. And then it's just got a shot of him drinking a cold glass of lemonade on a hot day. And it really evokes how good that feels. Such a simple human action. And he was able to get it down with no words and a few pictures so that any human being in the Western world and probably far beyond could look at it and relate to it and think, yeah, that is what being human is all about. Drinking cold lemonade on a very hot day. So yeah, I mean, Harvey's legacy is tremendous, and I'm really glad to be here and doing this, and I would hope that Harvey's legend will only grow as the years go by, because he was at the very start of the whole concept of telling stories based upon his real human life. He was at the very start of the autobiographical comics process, which has spawned such fantastic fruit. I mean, I think that probably the most interesting thing happening in comics is probably autobiographical pieces, and Harvey was right at the start of that. So yeah, a tremendous influence and a tremendous man. You know, let's have a look at this third question. Have I ever considered comics work in the purely autobiographical mode like Harvey? Probably not, because it wouldn't really work for me. I mean, the thing is that Harvey, why he was able to do such brilliant work with American Splendor is that he'd got a very bookly necessary, because it feels a bit wrong. It feels a bit like grandstanding, or for me, not for Harvey. Harvey is an unobtrusive presence in his story, whereas if you've got a snake worshipper who looks like me crashing into a story, it will destroy any sense of realism, and it will just be something about me. So when I do turn up in stories, I generally do it in disguise. I mean, I like to include autobiographical elements, but I prefer not to be present myself, even at the end of Voice of the Fire, where the final story is narrated by me. I'm kind of squirming and self-conscious, and I actually avoid using the words I, me, or my throughout the entire chapter because I didn't really want to be present. This is purely a personal neurosis, but I like using autobiographical elements, and Harvey was a master at that. I couldn't beat him at that. But I prefer to keep myself out of them because it would probably look wrong.
What's question one anyway?
What question one actually was, I quite liked this one. It was early in your career, you have been consistently attentive to feminist, racial and queer concerns. Could you speak about your own origins with these issues? Were there any particular writers or events that significantly informed your awareness at a young age? Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose that originally just the circumstances in which I grew up. When I look back upon them later, I would see those circumstances as informing a lot of my awareness. I grew up in an area of Northampton which a few hundred years ago was the whole of Northampton. So this was where most of the history happened. By the time I was born, it was already a slum that was avoided by most of the town's better heeled population. Today, it's the red light district. So it's always been a place, it's in the top couple of percent for deprivation for the entire country, and it's always been a place that where you become keenly aware of social differences. And perhaps because it was the bottom rung on the ladder, it was always a place that was quite accepting to other people. There was a black slave from Tennessee who apparently still had a brand upon his shoulder. When he finally arrived in Northampton in 1897, he settled in the boroughs and everyone down there completely accepted him. When I was growing up, there really wasn't. I didn't notice a great deal of racial prejudice in the place where I was growing up. Of course, there were unexamined prejudices that I didn't realise about till later. I would say that probably to answer your question, it wasn't until the mid-60s when I was about 14 or 15. And that happened to coincide very nicely with the hippie underground explosion. And it was probably in underground culture, which has got a lot of things wrong with it, but it was opening up a discussion about all sorts of things, about gay or queer rights, about women's liberation, about black issues. These were things that were just being talked about, it seemed to me, for the first time in the 1960s. And that probably had a really formative influence upon the way that I turned out politically. So let's have a look and see about. Oh yes.
What's number 4?
Number 4 is Alan, your public reaction to news of your work being adapted by others, whether by filmmaker or contemporary comic book writer, i.e. the recent handling of many of your Green Lantern Corps concepts, is generally negative. Yeah, you can say that again. But in so much of your work, you've taken characters created by others in directions the original authors never intended. Lost Girls and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen are obvious examples. And when it comes to mainstream comics, it's arguable that nobody has ever been better than you at springing the everything you thought you know about Character X is wrong surprise. Comics is itself by its nature, a serialized pass the baton medium in which one creator hands over concepts to another. How do I reconcile disapproval over the adaptation of your own comics work with your own adaptation of the work of others? I hope this question doesn't come off as disrespectful, though I suppose it definitely qualifies as impertinent. Not at all, not at all. That was a very respectful question. I think that my answer to it, which will probably be shorter than the actual question, is that you're talking about two different things there. In terms of comics, yes, when I entered the comics medium, I preferred creating my own characters, things like Halo Jones and stuff like that. But the nature of the comics medium at the time was that you were handed other people's characters. And at the time, I didn't see anything wrong with that. I was handed Swamp Thing by Len Wein, who was the creator. He seemed to be quite happy for me to change it around and make it a new concept that I was happier working with. All of these things, it was the way that comics were. And after a while, I began to have doubts about that. I can remember when I was offered, this was to work with Brian Bolland upon the Judge Dredd Batman team up. And this was something that was going to happen until I had a word with John Wagner, who is a good friend of mine, and who, he may not have been the actual creator of Judge Dredd, but he was the person most associated with its success. John told me that he was very angry to hear that I'd be taking this Judge Dredd character, which was not what I'd been told. So I dropped the project upon the instant because I don't believe in taking work from other people. I eventually got to the point where I felt uncomfortable about dealing with any franchise character. And a few years ago, I stopped. I decided that I would probably never work upon any franchise character ever again, whether that be a superhero in a comic or whether that be Doctor Who or some movie franchise, that I really had no interest in working upon other people's characters. Now, when you get to the literary field, which is something different to comics, in literature, almost as far back as literature goes, there has been a tendency to take characters that are obsolete or where the authors have died. I mean, if you look at the Orlando character from the League, this was somebody who was originally a swipe from the Legends of Roland. Roland becomes Orlando. And we then find that someone does Orlando Furioso. It's followed about 80 years later by another author taking the same character with, I think, Orlando Inamorata. Virginia Woolf comes along a few hundred years later and decides to recreate the character as her dual-gendered character, Orlando. You've got Edgar Allan Poe writes A. Gordon Pym. Jules Verne likes it, so he decides to set a story in the same universe and does his novel, The Ice Sphinx. There is just a tradition of characters, discarded characters from the past, from literature, meeting up together. In fact, with the League, I found out that one of the few Hermann Hesse novels that I didn't bother reading back in the psychedelic haze of the hippie period was a thing called Journey to the East, where I've recently discovered that it concerns the exploits of a group of characters taken from mythology and fiction that include characters like Tristram Shandy and Puss in Boots, and they're going around the world having adventures, and they're referred to as the League. And I promise you, I really had no awareness of that before I started work upon the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. In literature, I would say that it's different. I would say it might be splitting hairs, but I'm not adapting these people characters. I'm not doing an adaptation of Dracula or King Solomon's Mines. What I am doing is stealing them. There is a difference between doing an adaptation, which is evil, and actually stealing characters, which, as long as everybody's dead or you don't mention the names, is perfectly all right by me. I'm not trying to be glib here. I genuinely do feel that in literature you've got a tradition that goes back to Jason and the Argonauts of combining literary characters because everyone wants to see how they'd have got on, whether that's Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper or Moriarty or Dracula or Arsène Lupin. It's just irresistible to do these fictional mashups. They've been going on for hundreds of years, and I feel that I'm in part of a proud literary tradition in doing that, with taking comic characters that have been created by cheated old men. I feel that is different. So that's just my take on the subject. So let's have a look at question 5. Given the number of recent texts over the last several years that have been published on Alan and his work, what are Alan's feelings about his life and creations being utilised in the classroom, particularly American private college humanities courses? I suppose it's kind of nice, isn't it? I don't think about it a lot because I'm a bit estranged from the education process. My own education really didn't go that well. But I understand that, I mean, education is obviously one of the most important use to people within the education system. Then I'm very pleased that they should be there. With regard to the humanities courses, I'm particularly pleased that they should be there. But we don't know what it means until we've contemporary pages as a teaching document for ceremonial magic and basic Kabbalah. And you've written a great deal about magic in other venues as well, particularly about the fine line between a functional artistic kind of madness and a madness that's a sign of brokenness or disease. What advice would you give to someone who was just beginning to practice magic and to think of themselves as a magician today? Advice. Well, I would say be careful and try to remember to keep the 4 basic magical weapons and the properties that they symbolize, more importantly, with you at all times. What you and your compassion and your basic drive, your will, or a magician, because basically the magician is just human being writ large. So yes, you need a kind of chaotic your highest self. And above all, you probably need compassion, because even if you've got the other three and everything is succeeding perfectly, if you don't have compassion, you'll end up as a monster. If you've got those four basic things, then I would simply advise you to, yes, be careful, treat all of this with respect, because it's all real, at least inside your head, and that's the only place it needs to be real. And then progress adventurously. Don't be afraid to think new or unorthodox things. And try and make sure that whatever magical insights you're receiving are applicable to ordinary everyday life. If they are simply describing conditions in some imaginary universe that only exists to you, they're probably not of a great deal of use. But if they're telling you things that you can actually use in your everyday interactions with other people, that you can actually use in your own creative life, then they're probably useful and probably genuine. Good luck with it. Good luck with it. You're somewhat surprisingly not the only acclaimed comics writer from the UK to also be a vocal magician. Obviously, I'm talking about Grant Morrison here, who has never been terribly shy about his views on you or your work. Can we possibly draw you out on your views of him and his work? Well, let me see. The reason I haven't spoken about Grant Morrison generally is because I'm not very interested in him, and I don't really want to get involved with a writer of his caliber in some sort of squabble. But for the record, since you asked, the first time I met him, he was a aspiring comics writer from Glasgow. I was up there doing a signing or something. They asked if I could perhaps if they could invite a local comics writer who was a big admirer of mine along to the dinner. So I said, yeah. This was, I think, the only time that I met him to speak to. He said how much he admired my work, how it had inspired him to want to be a comics writer. And I wished him the best of luck. I told him I'd look out for his work. When I saw that work in 2000 AD, I thought, well, this seems as if it's a bit of a cross between Captain Britain and Marvel Man, but that's probably something that he'll grow out of. It was on that basis that I recommended him to Karen Berger when she was starting. Then there started a kind of a strange campaign of things in fanzines where he was expressing his opinions of me, as you put it. He later explained this as saying that when he started writing, he felt that he wasn't famous enough, and that a good way of becoming famous would be to say nasty things about me, which I suppose is a tactic, although not one that, of course, I'm likely to appreciate. So at that point, I decided, after I'd seen a couple of his things and they seemed incredibly derivative, I just decided to stop bothering reading his work. And that's largely sort of proven successful. It's but there still seems to be this kind of tell him no. And as far as I know, he is the only bone of contention between me and Michael Moorcock. Michael Moorcock is a sweet, sweet man. I believe he has only ever written one letter of complaint to a publisher over the appropriation of his work. That was to DC Comics over Grant Morrison. So the only bone of contention between me and Michael Moorcock is which of us Grant Morrison is ripping off the most. I say that it's Michael Moorcock. He says it's me. We've nearly come to blows over it, but I'm reluctant to let it go that far, because I mean I'm probably more nimble than Moorcock. I've got a few years on him. I'm probably faster, but Moorcock is huge. He's like a bear. He could just like take my arm off with one sweep of his paw. So we'll let that sort of go undecided for the moment. But those are pretty much my thoughts upon Grant Morrison, and hopefully now I've explained that I won't have to mention his name again. So on to the next question. To tide us over until Jerusalem is visited upon us, please describe in brief, but with fun, personal, experiential detail, your specific understanding of the nature and meaning of what we call time. Well, this is quite a big one. I remember that during what I later came to think of as my first magical experience, this was back on January the 7th in 1994, about a month after I declared myself to be a magician on my 40th birthday. And I remember a point during this fairly spectacular and overwhelming experience where I suddenly had the insight, along with Steve Moore, who was present at the same time, that if space-time was a single indivisible thing, then all of it existed at once, and it was all eternal. I think at the time I realised that this meant that nobody ever died, and that every moment was eternal, every person was eternal, that at the time we seemed to be actually outside of time, in a space where all of time is happening at once. And I remember thinking, but I've been talking about this in my stories for years. I've been talking about it in some of the early Future Shocks, the idea of time as a coterminous solid. I've been talking about it in, of course, Dr. Manhattan, with his view of time. Been talking about it in From Hell. And that kind of made sense, that if time is as I think it to be, it makes perfect sense that we should get premonitions or memories of the future. I think that there is some highly contested scientific research going on at the moment that seems to suggest that we do remember things both ways in time. Although obviously our memory of the past is a lot stronger than our memory of the future. So this has all boiled down into Jerusalem. All of these thoughts that have been with me for probably most of my career. And I've tried to express what that means in terms of ordinary human life. What does it mean if every moment is eternal? What does it mean if we have our lives, for better or for worse, over and over and over again, and that every time feels like the first time, except for those little moments of deja vu that this is probably not the first time that we've had this conversation, or even the millionth. That in my idea of the universe, nothing is lost, everything is forever. And there was a beautiful, beautiful little quote from Albert Einstein that I discovered about halfway through working upon Jerusalem. This was a few months before Einstein himself died, and he was consoling the widow of another physicist. And he said, the thing is, to a physicist such as myself, death isn't really a big deal, because I understand the persistent illusion of transience, which is a lovely phrase, and it probably sums up everything that I'm saying in Jerusalem. If I'd only read it before I started, I could have probably saved myself some 600,000 words or so, but those are the breaks. Yeah, it's what I would say is this is not an afterlife, but everybody gets the life that they have got, and they get it forever. That's kind of fair. It works for me. And it's sort of the idea that everything is precious. It doesn't require a God necessarily, although there's plenty of room for one if a God is to your liking. It's a completely secular idea of eternity. And I think also that if you were going to draw a moral from it, if there was a moral dogma that would be attached to this belief, it would surely be, don't do anything that you can't live with forever. And in that sense, it doesn't really matter whether my theory is true or not. All that it means is that whether it's true or not, you should live every moment as if you will be living it eternally. And also try to comport yourself in a way which means that you won't be regretting things, potentially for eternity. So I don't know if there was a lot of fun experiential stuff in there, but that is pretty much my current understanding of time. And I think that Thompson is just bringing me a pot of tea, if you'll just excuse me. Look at that lovely teapot. Oh. In fact, while we're taking a tiny break for tea, you'd perhaps also like to look at my shoes, which I look at those. Can you see that? Yeah. See, I wore them thinking that there'd be more of me visible, and it seems a shame to waste such a rare occasion. You're probably thinking that Alan Moore, he claims to be a vegetarian, and yet he's obviously flayed a couple of Dalmatians for those shoes, but I assure you that's not the case. It's actually, it's little tiny cows. There, if you can see that. Yeah, little tiny cows. They're about 3 inches high, about 4 inches long, and it takes the skins of about 5 of them for each shoe. Anyway, my tea is it poor? Yes, it is. Let's have a look at this next question. You can see that I haven't done this before, can't you? All industry related and business nonsense aside, which of your comic works are you most proud of? Difficult to divorce it from the industry related and business nonsense. It's kind of difficult to think much about works that I no longer own. I tend to not enjoy doing it, so I tend not to. So that would mean that the works that I am genuinely proudest of, the ones that actually fill me with satisfaction when I think of them, are things like From Hell, and Lost Girls, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. These are the works that I keep about me, and That's not to say that the other works that I've done weren't equally enjoyable at the time, or that I wasn't equally proud of them at the time. But I can only really speak for how I feel at the present, and a lot of my own work has kind of become a little bit toxic to me, which is a shame, and it's not to the degradation of the work at all. It's just my own personal feelings. So I do tend to stick with the works that I actually feel connected to still, and that would be, Eddie Campbell's incredible work in From Hell, the marvelous job that Melinda did with Lost Girls, and the ongoing delights of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And actually, I nearly brought it round to show everybody, but I got the cover proof through for League 2009 today, which means that, Kevin's finished the entire thing. It's in production now, and it will be out in a couple of weeks. And I am 40 pages into the next 48-page adventure of the League. So that'll be finished in another week, and then Kevin can start drawing it. It's called Nemo Heart of Ice, and I'm guessing it will be out before the autumn. But these are the works that I'm still attached to and I'm still proudest of. Let's have a slurp on my tea. He said that the work of Harvey Pekar was very important for you, but it looks very different from your work. So he talks about his life, while your stories are about heroes, magic, historical characters. What is the link between you and Pekar's work? Well, there's a few incredibly strong links. For one thing, Harvey Pekar is one of the very, very few blue-collar talents in the comic book field. This is not to say that people from the middle classes don't do wonderful comics. Of course they do. But my own personal background is very much rooted in the English working classes. And something about Harvey's perspective always rang so true to me, that the sincerity, the honesty of it, the crystalline honesty of it that was as clear as water. These were all things that impressed me immensely, that he was able to talk about working class life with such a lucid voice. And the other thing would be Harvey's attachment to the location in which he lived. His love of Cleveland for the ground upon which he was standing, which could be anywhere. It could be Northampton. It could be the places that you all live. We should value the humble streets and boulevards and houses that surround us. They won't be there forever. And they have incredible histories tied into them. We should value them, we should protect them, and we should celebrate them in the way that Harvey did. Just the ordinary human lives that are going on in these places. I think that for my part, I want to celebrate the same things as Harvey, but Harvey's voice was not mine. We've got distinctive voices, and for my part, I would rather do something like Jerusalem, where there is an incredible amount of autobiographical stuff in it. There is although I'm dressed up as so that nobody recognizes me. This is an old trick of mine, as anybody who read Big Numbers would be painfully aware. I like to appear in drag, so as not to disrupt the narrative. But so there's autobiographical stuff about me, about my family, and more importantly, about the history of the neighborhood in which I grew up. It's expressed in terms of fiction. It's got all of the usual extravagant fictional devices that people might have come to expect of me. So it's got a few monsters and things like that in. No superheroes, or at least not yet. I'm a few chapters away from the end, so I suppose anything could happen. But yeah, it's that level that I connected with Harvey upon the most. That his love and tender observations of ordinary human life as it is lived for by far the largest section of the population, and for the town, the environment around him. That is the level on which Harvey's work probably spoke to me most profoundly. Now, I was wondering about your creative process. I do that all the time. Do you write organically and let the characters and plot lines build as you write, or do you plan everything out in detail beforehand? A mix of both, perhaps. Yeah, a mix of both to a degree, and also depending upon how I'm feeling, depending upon what day it is, depending upon the weather. I mean, with this current thing that I'm doing, this little 48-page, it's meant as a kind of an appetizer. It's something between courses. Before we get on with book 4 of the League, we thought we'd perhaps do a few of these little 48-page volumes that all stand on their own. And with that, I suppose I spoke to Kevin. I tried to give it some parameters, some dimensions. We talked about, all right, what did Kevin fancy drawing? Which of the characters would he like to have a go at? And he said, well, Jenny Nemo, we introduced her in 1910. She was a great character, and then we just got a glimpse of her as an old woman in 1969. And yes, I had always intended to go back and sort of do something with that character. So we decided, yes, all right, we'll do something about Nemo's daughter. And then we kind of narrowed it down a bit further. I asked what period it would be best to be set in. And judging from Janny's age and the age of some of the supporting characters, we eventually decided to go for 1925. And then we started looking at what the fictional world was like in 1925. Charles Foster Kane would have been around. King Kong would not yet have left Skull Island, unfortunately. So we narrowly avoided being able to use King Kong. But once I'd got a vague idea of a story that involves a trip to Antarctica, then I kind of just sat down, and it's been a couple of years since I've actually done any comics work. I finished Neonomicon, I finished years ago, and it's been a good couple of years at least since I finished my work upon League Volume 3. So it took me a while to get back into it. I started trying to plan out what I was going to do, and then I thought, oh, I'll just draw a rectangle on the page and call that the first page, and divide that up into some panels, and then stare at those kind of blank panels until an idea for a picture comes to me, and then that will suggest another picture, and it all just kind of works organically from there. We're trying to do it in 8-page chunks this time. We thought that a 48-page narrative, that's pretty tight. We haven't got the luxury to investigate subplots the way that we did in any of the volumes of Century. So we decided we'd do it in little 8-page, as if we were doing it for a serial, because that makes sure that the work is kept lean and tight, and that the pacing is kind of fast enough to get through all the events at an acceptable rate before you get to the finish. Yeah, it varies a great deal. Sometimes I will at least try and plan it. I'm planning this out in 8 pages at a time. all right, what am I going to be doing in these next 8 pages? Well, that page is a right-hand page, so I can use that to set up something that will be a surprise when we turn over and we get the nice spread. I can put put a nice big image that gives Kevin something to draw there. And the story kind of suggests itself. You know the characters, and the story kind of emerges. And I've been doing this for so long that I'm not really worried about whether we're going to be able to end it properly. You know, I'm pretty certain that this will all pull together very, very nicely. So, let's have a look. The depiction of time as elastic or relative has come up in your work throughout the years, most notably perhaps in From Hell. We're seeing it again in League Century with The Prisoner of London. Could you speak about texts that inspired or expound upon these ideas? Also, is this something explored more directly in Jerusalem? Well, yeah, as I was just saying, this is pretty much the conceptual core of Jerusalem, although there's a huge hairy mass of tangents that I've wrapped around that concept. As far as where the idea surfaced from, probably originally it came from personal observation. Back when I was living down Andrews Road, it was a very dark house, and my gran, who lived with us, used to have old framed photographs of former family members. My grandfather, he was dead before I was born. I'd never actually known him, and various uncles. And I remember looking at these bleached pictures of sepia-tinted old men that I didn't recognise, and I can remember as a small child wondering if when that photograph was taken, did they know they were dead? Did they know that someone was looking back at that photograph, looking back at the light upon that particular afternoon with them standing on the pub steps or wherever it was? Did they know that there were people in the future looking back long after they were dead? And of course, then the thought occurs that when you have a photograph taken, you realise, oh, so I'm already dead as well. Which is some of the thinking which led to Jerusalem. It didn't really get formalised until I started to look at some of the great eccentric late Victorian mathematicians. Lewis Carroll was by no means alone in that period as somebody who got over mathematical ideas, because he was a mathematician, in an inventive and often fantastic fictional form. There was Edwin Abbott, so good they named him twice, who wrote a book called Flatland, in which he talks about the adventures of a Mr. A Square, who is a two-dimensional creature living in a two-dimensional world. His world is intruded upon by a higher dimensional creature who comes from the third dimension. This is, I believe, Mr. A Cube. And by talking about higher dimensions from the point of view of the second dimension, he was able to make these fascinating analogies regarding what the fourth dimension might be in relation to our own third dimension. So that was probably an influence. He gets the ideas over very, very lucidly. And then, of course, there was C. Howard Hinton, who I didn't really discover until I was researching From Hell. This would have been back in round about 1989. And I'd found out that one of William Gould's best friends was the philosopher and free love enthusiast, James Hinton. And Hinton had a son C. Howard Hinton, who had, I think, both inherited his father's philosophical bent and also inherited his father's interests in free love. Apparently, he was pretty much run out of the country when it was discovered he was living in a ménage à trois. He went to live in Paris, where at least they know what ménage à trois means, of course. And he had written this book called What is the Fourth Dimension, where he is describing something which is very similar to the concept in Jerusalem. I believe that he, as a thought experiment, he imagined a kind of a wooden framework box that has wires strung across it at various angles, and he imagined a transparent immaterial film that was rising up through this box, a two-dimensional film representing our three-dimensional consciousness moving up through a solid fourth-dimensional space-time. And he was pointing out how we would not see the strings, we would not see the wires or the framework. We would only see the points at which the wires intersected our two-dimensional membrane. That there would be no change that was going on anywhere in the structure apart from in our consciousness. And so, yeah, these were all really important things that started me thinking along these lines. Read a story that was concerned with time. It raises questions. So is the past still there? Is the future there yet? Just these basic questions, if you follow them for long enough, you do pretty much arrive at a space-time which is a stupendous solid through which our consciousness just happens to be passing. Let me see. How do I achieve such an even balance between expressing philosophical ideas and the sheer fun of entertaining in storytelling? Well, as I was saying earlier, if there is no fun in the project, then it's not going to work. I've always tried to have as much fun and enthusiasm for every project that I've worked on. Sometimes it's not going to be there as much as you might have hoped. Those have always been the works which I've felt most disappointed with. They've not been fun to do. Luckily, there haven't been many of them. But they've not been fun to do, and I've not been pleased with the result. But generally, a lot of my working process is about finding ways to make things interesting and fun. Now, to be able to combine philosophical ideas with that, all you have to do is to find philosophical ideas fun, which I do. I try to keep up, not just philosophy, science. I read The New Scientist religiously, although that's probably not the right way to describe the way that you read a rational publication, but I read it quite avidly every week, because just some of the cosmological theories that happen to come up, it doesn't matter whether they're true. They're just wonderful things to consider because they give you a new angle from which to consider this existence of ours, which is true of any decent or viable philosophy. With some of the stuff in New Scientist, I mean, like there was some explanations for why we live in such a perfect universe. One explanation was that since the mathematical equation for the beginnings of the universe is apparently exactly the same as the mathematical equations describing the event horizon of a black hole, except for the fact that the equation is backwards. Some people have said at the other end of the black hole that basically the the black hole might be a kind of cosmic birth canal that is spawning baby universes. And thus the reason why our universe is so well adapted is it's not the first universe, it's one in a long chain of universes, and it is relatively evolved. The reason I really like that theory is that it's very seldom that you get the idea of a baby universe. You don't really very often get the chance to go, about something that's as big as a universe. So that is a great theory. There was also the theory that we're all, this was another really good one, that within the next 20 years we will probably have come up with a working quantum supercomputer. Now how that works is that it can do its computations in a number of effectively parallel universes at the same time. This makes it much faster and much more powerful than anything that we have at present. When we have a quantum supercomputer, it is reckoned that it will be able to hold more information than there are actually particles in the known universe. This means that we'll be able to come up with a simulated universe full of simulated life forms. Now, what the person who came up with this theory was suggesting was, if that's true, then this is almost certainly not the first time that it has happened. That the greater probability is that we are in a virtual simulation of a universe that is within a simulated universe, that is within a simulated universe, and so on. An infinitely nested arrangement. Difficult to, but what we should do is to not be boring, because you know, with characters in video games or computer games, that the person playing this simulation, who is effectively God from our point of view, is liable to actually be in the simulation themselves as a kind of avatar. Now, assuming that ego works the same way at this upper level of existence that it does in our own level, we might assume that that person who is playing this game would probably want to go for a character who was, I don't know, admired in some way, was perhaps a minor celebrity. So what this person who came up with this theory was suggesting was that it's probably best to suck up to minor celebrities because they might be God. Now, this still gives you an unmanageable amount of minor celebrities to deal with. How are you supposed to sort amongst those thousands and thousands of minor celebrities? I would say, perhaps if you narrowed it down a bit by only sucking up to those celebrities who perhaps look a bit like you might imagine God to look, or perhaps have the kind of resonant, deep voice that you might expect the creator of the universe to have. So yeah, these kind of philosophies, I enjoy playing with them and turning them over in my mind. Yeah, so remember, I'm God, suck up to me. Now, let's have a look at what's the work of yours that you feel is most underappreciated? I can't really complain, but if I had to complain, if you were to force me to complain, I'd probably say that the most underappreciated work that I've done is probably A Small Killing with Oscar Zarate. It was a kind of a brave comic book experiment of the kind that people used to think were viable for a brief period during the middle 1980s. where Galank's books were saying, hey, adult comics are happening, graphic novels. Let's try to do some really adult work. And I was lucky enough to be working with the incredibly talented and incredibly sweet Oscar Zarate. And Oscar was contributing lots of ideas. It was a really interesting working process, and we were talking about something which was back then still going on. We were talking about the culture of the 1980s, of Margaret Thatcher's Britain. We were talking about the way that that culture had changed, and we were talking about the moral changes that had been made by people immersed in that culture. It was 1,000 miles away from the superhero work that I was doing. And I still look back at that work with a great deal of pride. Oscar's artwork is astonishing, and I was very pleased at the way in which I think that I was able to convey the feeling of life during those times and the moral choices that people were being forced to make. Perhaps in our current, in our economically disastrous period that we're moving through, perhaps it might be time to give that book another look. But yeah, that's probably regarded a little bit less than it should. Okay, okay. First of all, thank you for Neonomicon, which was one of the best and easily most disturbing comics of 2010. Can you discuss a bit how the project came about and whether you have any intention to tell further tales within this Lovecraftian setting? Well, Neonomicon first came about because I had William Christensen Avatar, and he must have heard the plaintive whine in my voice, and he suggested that he had got some money that he could send me as an advance if I wanted to write a 100-page story. Now, I had previously done the story The Courtyard, which was one of the stories that I'd included in my abandoned Yuggoth Cultures collection, which was the majority of the text was left in the back of a taxi. You know, it was only the Courtyard and a few other pieces that still remained. But the Courtyard was fairly complete in itself, and it had some interesting characters and situations, and I'd thought at the time that it was an interesting approach to Lovecraft's fiction, in that it was set slightly in the future, that it was trying to avoid the regular tropes that people doing Lovecraft pastiches tend to employ. And so I was pleased with that, and I'd thought, yeah, but those characters, Aldo Sachs, I'd like to maybe pick up a story with him being interviewed in the asylum, and then where would it go from there? And Neonomicon kind of grew out of that. It took me into some places that I was surprised to find myself in. But perhaps that's the nature of writing a horror story. If you're not actually dealing with stuff that genuinely disturbs you, then you're probably not really doing your job properly. I know that I was sort of, dealing with the rape scene. A rape that goes on for about 2 issues. Normally, normally in my work, I will tend to, if there is such a scene, it will tend to be elided in some way. It will happen off stage. I think there's one rape in Lost Girls, and that is reduced. You hear about it, and you see a long distance silhouette of a young woman being carried out of a spinney by 2 ambulance men. But with Neonomicon, I decided that the best way to deal with the subject, the most moral way to deal with the subject, was not to look away, but to actually try and get across the nature of rape. Yes, it was rape with a horrifying, gigantic monster, but then, isn't it always? And I wanted to show that it's not a fate worse than death. It's something that happens with depressing frequency in the world, is a real thing, unlike sea monsters and the creations of H.P. Lovecraft. And it is shattering psychologically, or it can be. I didn't want to use it to titillate. So those scenes were written very, very carefully. And I was myself worried for a while that I might have transgressed, that I might have gone over a line, that I might have ended up saying things that I didn't mean to say. But I took another look at the story. This was before it came out. When I saw the first episode, I thought, actually, that's quite good. I'll go and read the other ones in script form. And yeah, I was pleased with it all the way through. It seemed, I thought, yeah, I can stand behind this. And when it came out and I saw the kind of job that Jason Burrows had done on it, which was exemplary, um, I was pleased that I'd done it. As to whether I'd want to do another one or not, yeah, if I could think of a story that was justified. Obviously, there'd be no point in doing a story that was just more sexually extreme or more shocking. That's not interesting. It might be a story set in the same milieu with the same characters, although I confess I haven't been able to think of one. Or it might be something that explores another part of Lovecraft's world. I've told William that I'll be telling him if I have got another story in me within the next couple of weeks. And I hope I can think of one, because I did enjoy doing Neonomicon. I did enjoy connecting with that Lovecraft stuff again. In fact, there's a strong Lovecraft element in the Nemo Heart of Ice. I mean, it takes place at the South Pole, so you figure it out. But that is a major plot element in this forthcoming league. Books for children that introduce them to the concepts of magic, art, and the gods, as in Promethea. Are there any you would recommend, or would you consider writing one? Yeah, I'd consider writing one. There's a load of projects that I should really love to do. But I'm 58. I mean, sort of, I've probably only got another 80 or 90 good years left in me. You know, so I don't know if I do manage to get around to writing one. Yes, I should love to. As to what books would be good for introducing children to the ideas of magic, I think that really with children you don't really have to introduce them to the ideas of magic. They've probably got a much better idea of what it is than we have. I remember that when I was a child and was first looking at ordinary storybooks, the illustrations in them, say a picture of a little room in a fairy cottage or something like that, it would seem to me that this place, because there was a drawing of it, it must exist in some sense. And I think that when I came to magic at the age of 40, one of the big realizations was that magic was exactly what I'd thought it was when I was 6 or 7. That I would say, if you're asking what books that you should provide a child with, then the books that I grew up with probably wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, I started off by reading children's books of mythology. This was what gave me my love of gods and remarkable beings, and probably which led to me displacing that love onto superheroes. Once I'd read all of the Norse, Greek, and Roman myths that I could lay my hands on, and yet there were new adventures of the Flash every month. So that was probably what brought about that change of allegiance. But I think that if you can perhaps try and instill in children the sense that, and this is, I'm saying this in retrospect, but the sense that the world of the mind, which is to say the world of magic, is as real as the material world, and it is possibly even more important. I think that to encourage children to think that the world of the mind is delightful but ultimately meaningless fantasy, that is how to take them away from magic. But I think encouraging children to explore the realm of ideas inside their mind and actually giving them the sense that that is a world that is as important and as valid as the physical world surrounding them, was fantastic. And its author, P.L. Travers, was an astonishing woman who actually had a fair degree of interest in the occult, or in what you might call magic. And she did write a wonderful book called What the Bee Knows. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily for children, but it's got a very warm tone to it that perhaps, yeah, some older children might like, but in the meantime, you could do worse than just getting some genuinely enchanting children's fiction, and there's probably no better enchanting children's fiction than Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers, although, of course, I would make a special case for Alice in Wonderland. Just encourage it because it is.
Do question 9 next.
Question 9. Dear Alan, I wanted to thank you for all the enjoyment your stories has brought over the years and the inspiration your work has meant to me as a comics maker in terms of expanding the boundaries of what the medium can do. You're welcome. Briefly, I'm a doctoral student at Columbia University in New York City, both writing and drawing my dissertation entirely in comic book form, the first of its kind, something I see as directly made possible by all that you've done for the medium. Specifically, the work is a discussion that argues for the educational importance of the visual alongside the verbal as a legitimate and necessary means of thinking. And by doing this in comics, I can walk the talk, tackling it both in content and form. If there's a question here, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the comics medium in terms of its visual verbal properties and spatial compositional aspects as being a tool for thought and expression. Yeah, no, I was talking about this earlier with Melinda. Authoritative form of narrative is a page of unillustrated text. I believe this because having worked on Jerusalem, I've realised just the incredible range of effects that you can get with just 26 letters. The most effective way of communicating. I would say that the comic strip narrative has frankly uncomfortable about reading lengthy text works. They've somehow got it into their head that this is only something that brilliant intellectuals do, and I think they're probably doing themselves a disservice. I think that if they actually got into a good book, they'd probably find that all of those pictures that they needed were just occurring naturally in their heads, in their own imagination. But comics, nevertheless, have got all sorts of properties that make them accessible to people for whom complex narratives, such as you might find in a book, are not particularly accessible. Now, I know I've probably gone on about this at length before, but I remember that when I was working on Brought to Light with Joyce, I would presumably have been prior to when they were producing their pro-Contra comic books as propaganda to be distributed in Nicaragua. But they had come to the conclusion that after trying out various ways of communicating information to people, including text, photographs with captions, text with illustrations, so that people would remember what they had been told. That medium was comic strip. Now, since becoming interested in magic when I was 40, I've had some speculative thoughts upon why this might be. Why is comics a medium that seems to be able to get over its information so powerfully and so retainably? And I would say that it's possibly because what used to be called the left side of our brain, I mean, we've realised it's a bit less neat and a bit more complex than that. But that is to say, the side of our brain that controls our higher reasoning functions and our language skills, it would seem to me that the unit of currency for that side of the brain must be the word. But the other side of our brain, what used to be called our right brain, that seemed to be in control of our pre-verbal skills, of our unconscious mind. So I would imagine that if this is a pre-verbal part of the brain, then its main unit of currency, if you like, would be the image. So perhaps it is by the combination of written words and imagery, the unique combination of written words and imagery that comics presents. Maybe both halves of the brain are called upon to act at the same time. It may be this kind of a task, reading a comic, which is going to call it. Maybe this that makes comics such a powerful medium. It offers a lot of room for exploration, and we've barely begun. In terms of the comics medium, we've barely scratched the surface. The comics medium has not existed in its current form for more than 70 years, and I don't know where it will be going in future. It seems to be, to me, the industry seems to be in the doldrums at the moment, although there is still some fantastic work occurring at the fringes of the medium. But, 70 years is no time at all in the lifespan of an art form. Look at music, look at painting, look at photography, look at how long it's taken all of these things to actually find their feet as valid art forms. And I think that the possibilities for comics have pretty much been untouched. That there are endless possibilities for what could be done with this medium. It could be effective in so many different areas of life. And I think it may be something to do with that right brain, left brain connection that comics afford. That's just my best guess.
Yeah, you do number 12.
Number 12. Hello, Mr. Moore. Hello. I'm fascinated by the use of details from local history, geography and architecture in your work. I think I can see why Northampton is so familiar to you, but where does the inspiration to research an area like, say, Highbury come from? Is it suggested by a third party, or do you just pick postcodes at random and go mining the library? Thanks very much for your time. Okay, yeah, it's with, say, the Highbury working, which is a really good example, it will generally be suggested by a third party. In this case, it was a gentleman called, I think it was Chris Brooks, who was a friend of the KLF, or the K Foundation. Bill Drummond, Jimmy Corti. They'd just been round to show the film that they did of burning £1 million on the Isle of Jura. One of the venues at which they showed their film was my living room, and so I'd got quite friendly with Bill and Jimmy and Chris, who was there as well. And Chris was running a little club night down in London at a club called the Garage in Highbury. It was upstairs at the Garage, a smaller venue than the downstairs venue, but a creditable and respected one. And so, all right, that told me the area that I'd be doing this. I also knew the date that I'd be doing this. I'd be doing this sometime in November. So then the process of trying to read Highbury began. And at first I panicked because it was one of my earliest explorations of what is vaguely called psychogeography. And previously I'd found that there were loads of murders and ghosts and all these juicy ideas that could make a great piece of text and a great reading. When I started to look at Highbury and its history, I really couldn't find anything. And I began to doubt whether my premise that every single square yard of anywhere has got a fantastic history if you just dig deeply enough, I began to doubt that that was true. But I persevered. I started to look through unusual sources. For instance, I've got no interest in football whatsoever. However, the original home ground of the Arsenal Football Club had been at Highbury for decades and decades and decades, ever since it was moved from Woolwich Arsenal. So I thought, well, maybe if I get a book about football stadiums. So yes, I do have one book in my library, which is The Football Stadiums of Great Britain. And I found out all this fantastic stuff. Apparently there was a horse, when they were providing the backfill for the actual stadium, a horse that had been dragging a cart full of rubble to just put in the foundations. The horse dropped dead and was thrown into the foundations along with the rest of the rubbish. So there is this legend of a skeletal horse under the Highbury football ground, under the Arsenal ground. And I thought, well, that's a poetic image. I could imagine this skeleton of a horse that's running through the buried geological seams under the stadium. And we started to look into more underground stuff, found out that the Hackney Brook runs through there. It's one river with two sources. Found out some stuff. I was looking through the biography of the criminal Tony Lambrianou, who I'd met when I was doing the Cardinal and the Corpse with Ian Sinclair and Chris Pettit back in the early 90s. And Lambrianou was an associate of the Cray brothers. And looking in his biography, I found out that at the actual club where we'd be doing this, there had occurred this remarkable event that involved the singer Dorothy Squires, her husband Roger Moore, Jack the Hat McVitie, a famous victim of the Cray brothers. And I started to think, oh, there's this double-headed river that runs under Highbury. There's this connection with these twin gangsters. Then I found out that Chang and Eng, the original Siamese twins, had performed at the Highbury Barn, which had been a pleasure. That was when Highbury used to be one of London's pleasure hills. So yeah, I was finding this out from various books. Then me and Steve Moore took a long walk from Highgate all the way down the Holloway Road. And we were noting bits of graffiti. We were noting just odd, momentary things that may have only been there on that day. We noticed signs in the windows of pubs advertising live Chinese Elvis. We found a dance club down at the bottom, one of a chain of dance clubs called Ponanaz. Steve pointed out that we'd previously found out that there was a Roman garrison at Highbury who would have worshipped, because it was a cavalry garrison, they would have worshipped the Roman goddess of horse racing and the underworld, Epona, which is where we get our word pony, and which of course plays nicely into Ponanaz. You research the place until connections start to emerge. That's the basic process. And then you find a way of actually expressing those concepts, those poetical linkages. And each area has its own character. You know, I mean, we did, after doing the Highbury working, we did Snakes and Ladders, which was in Holborn, which is a couple of miles away from Highbury, same city, but different neighbourhood. And that had a completely different character. Whereas there was a freakishness to the nature of Highbury. There was Joe Meek and his strange murder-suicide. There was a lot of drugs, a lot of sex, a lot of weirdness. In Holborn, on the other hand, there was a lot of resurrection. It was where Oliver Cromwell's body, when it was dug up from its Westminster tomb after the restoration of the monarchy, so that they could kill him twice. It was in Red Lion Square that his body was left out overnight. That's a kind of resurrection. It was also in Red Lion Square that Dante Gabriel Rossetti lived with his lover and model Elizabeth Siddal, who of course she died in a genuine fit of romantic passion. He buried all of the poems that he'd written for her with her, and then horribly, tragically, the years went by and his new poems weren't setting the world on fire. His publishers were demanding something, so he had her dug up and retrieved the poems, and it destroyed him as a human being, as an artist. He never wrote again. He'd betrayed her, and he'd betrayed his own feelings for her, at least as he saw things. So that's another kind of resurrection. And there was the story of Arthur Mack, and all of these things. You've just got to trust the process. You start looking at the place, and if there aren't connections, that's just because you haven't looked hard enough, or you haven't looked in the right places. You carry on with it, and I'm convinced that everywhere, wherever you're standing, is a marvellous, indeed phantasmagorical place that is every bit as rich and wonderful as the landscapes of the Arabian Nights. You know, that is my firm contention.
If you do 15.
15. What are your thoughts on digital comics? Well, I have actually had some thoughts upon digital comics. When I was introduced to the concept of these new digital devices, and there's a project that I'm working on at the moment with my friend and collaborator, the photographer Mitch Jenkins. I've been working upon this for a couple of years now from its initial conception. It's grown into a big, unwieldy project that has lots of different dimensions to it. one of these dimensions was actually thinking about the possibilities of electronic comics. When we looked at what the comic companies are doing, it seems that they're just taking the same, from my point of view, the same regrettable, formulaic, dull comic books that they've been publishing for the last couple of decades and just putting them up online. It struck me that there would be lots and lots of new things that you could do with this medium, that everything about it would be changed. For example, the standard layout of a comics page is completely dictated by the print technology of the late 1930s. The essential form of the comic book hasn't changed since then. The reason we have about 6 panels on a page as an average is because that gives you a decent sized panel given the standard page size, and about 24 pages in a comic, that will give you a decent chunk of story. This is all predicated upon print technology. Obviously, those rules don't apply when you're talking about a device like an iPad or a Kindle or something like that. Neither of which devices I own, nor am I ever likely to own them. But that doesn't mean that I'm not at least aware of the concepts. So I started to think about ways that you could enhance comics, perhaps by using digital medium. And I think, to cut a long story short, the conclusion I came to was that there may be certain sorts of comic book that could be enhanced by using music, by using limited animation effects, by using some of the things that comics can do. They would have to be a new sort of comics. Maybe even superhero comics could work like that, because superhero comics are all about extravagant, flashy ideas. They're all about the bells and whistles. They are hyperbolic and they are spectacular. So maybe having lots of effects would in some way jazz them up. But I was thinking about, what about ordinary comics? What about the comics that I actually like and admire? And I thought about, just say for example, imagine that there's a page of Will Eisner's Spirit. Now, let's say that Will Eisner has decided to make this a silent page, where you've just got the spirit creeping around investigating an empty house. Now, let's say that this hypothetical Will Eisner has decided to include one panel just purely for atmospheric effect, where he shows you the faucet in the kitchen, and there's a single bead of water, an elongated bead that is just hanging under the faucet, and that's all that's in the panel. Now, if you're used to reading comics, you can tell that that elongated bead is going to fall off and another one is going to form. You can probably imagine what that dripping will sound like. We've all heard dripping taps. Now, for someone trying to do a digital adaptation of that page, I would imagine that the temptation would be almost unbelievable. Hey, this will be an easy win. We can make the tap actually drip, and we can put the sound of a dripping tap on the soundtrack. Now, this was what made me rethink it, because actually the comic book page, in the circumstances that I was just talking about, the comic book page is a more sophisticated medium of communication than the meaningless gimmickry that has been added to something which was elegant to start with. So it's something which will need a lot of thinking about. I'm not saying that the idea of digital comics is one that I'm ruling out. I mean, I've seen some of the work that Leah and John have been doing on The Thrill Electric, which was a digital comic done for the online section of Channel 4. And I thought that they had really done a good job of thinking their way around a new medium and its potential. Whether I myself will ever dabble in it, I don't know. It's a possibility. It's certainly something which I'm turning over in my mind if I could think of a reason for it that seemed to me to be valid and wasn't just for the sake of connecting myself up to a flashy new technology and trying to appear modern. It would have to be a valid reason, but I'm certainly not ruling it out.
21.
21. Has there ever been a time in your comics work or other projects when the direction of your story has been radically altered based on how your collaborator may have interpreted something or due to direct feedback from them? Well, it's more organic than that. But as I was talking earlier about this current League project, Nemo Heart of Ice, me and Kevin both thought, hey, let's do something that isn't as long and interminable as Century, as a refresher course to clean our palate between the longer volumes. And so I was trying to respond to, all right, Kevin has had a really long slog doing this, 220 something page volume of the League, volume 3. So I thought, okay, let's try and give Kevin something that he really wants to draw. And so I sit and talk it over with Kevin. I try and get a sense of what would be fun for him. When we hit upon the 1920s, Kevin was immediately sort of aware of the possibilities that this gave us for all sorts of things with the costumes, things with the architecture, things with the general design. He thought, hey, we can do a nice Art Deco Nautilus that is just how it looked in the 1920s. He will also start thinking about storytelling. I'll ask him any particular kind of storytelling that you might like to do. And he remembered an artist, I think one of the British Amalgamated Press artists, who did really good solid work, but his speciality was long, tall panels that conveyed a sense of real vertigo. And I thought, well, that's interesting. We're having a lot of this episode happening in Antarctica. That kind of landscape, it is a gigantic, dwarfing landscape. So let's try some taller panels. Let's try and get away from the standard 9-panel grid that we tend to use most often on the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Let's chop things up a bit. And so it's a matter of being responsive to your collaborator, to try and think, what do they enjoy doing? What will get the most enthusiasm out of them and thus the best job? It isn't even yet. Sometimes Kevin makes direct suggestions and then I will try my best to fit them in. Kevin suggested Charles Foster Kane. That worked perfectly. He also suggested King Kong, but it didn't really fit. It would have meant setting it in about 1933 or something like that in order to fit in with the time frame that we've imposed upon ourselves. And it was cramping the story too much, and it would have been cute to have a little reference to King Kong in the background, but eventually we decided that there were more advantages from doing it about 8 years earlier. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't worth screwing up a lot of the other narrative points just to have a little reference to King Kong. So it's not so much, it's a constant process of feedback. I'm giving the artist ideas and telling him how my thinking's going. Kevin is giving me ideas, supplying fantastic bits of stuff about some of the old American pulp heroes, the boy inventors of the late 19th century and early 20th century, because we started to see how they could play a useful part in our story, which is mostly set either in Antarctica or in America. It gave us a chance to, at least for a few pages, show some of our fictional America, which after doing 2 or 3 volumes that have been set exclusively in London, it was quite interesting to explore some other bits of the League's world, you know. So it's an organic process. It's feedback in both ways. You end up, if it's working well, you end up as some sort of weird gestalt organism, where it's some sort of combination of me and Kevlan or something like that, where you're both concentrating upon what is going to produce the best story. That's pretty much how it works.
Right, 22.
22. You've been increasingly vocal that you are unimpressed by mainstream Western comics. Have you been exposed to any current alternative comics or art comics? And if so, who do you think is producing interesting work nowadays? Now, this is a question that does put me upon the spot. I mean, I haven't been reading a lot of comics. The ones that I have been reading have all been little alternative comics that I've seen here and there. I remember Josie Long gave me a really wonderful comic called Solipsistic Pop, which was a group of young British indie cartoonists who'd put together this really good looking and really nicely produced newspaper of their various comic strips. I can't, I'm afraid, remember any of the artists' names. Yeah, I mean, like, the stuff that's being done on the margins in comics is the only place in comics that I really feel any energy coming from. And yeah, I would say that a lot of the stuff that is being done at the moment that is interesting, that is artistic, this is all stuff that has descended from Harvey Pekar and from people like him, although there weren't that many people who were like Harvey Pekar. I think that the people who are still keeping that kind of spirit alive, and they know who they are, you know, I think that they will always be doing interesting work. With regard to some of the more well-known independent producers, and I would say this is from a position of ignorance. I haven't read a lot of, I've not read everything that these people have done, but I've seen a couple of books. There's a certain kind of material where I'm starting to feel that explorations of the emotional life or lack of contemporary characters or individuals is starting to grate a little bit. It's just that the tropes of that kind of comic have become very well known, and there's something a bit unseemly about people who come from America, who come from England, who come from anywhere in the privileged Western world, probably particularly from America. There's something a bit unseemly about endless comics talking about the hollowness of modern life. There are people with bigger problems. That's not to say that we should never discuss the you know, the bleakness or the flatness of the modern experience, but when that has become pretty much a sole topic for a number of creators. You know, I wish that they would, I don't know, do like Joe Sacco, actually look at something that's happening in the world that has importance and focus your talents upon that. You know, that's for my money. You know, that's the way that I feel about it. I'm sorry that I can't list a huge. I mean, Craig Thompson. He is somebody who I just saw that the most recent thing he did, the thing about the harem girl. It looks wonderful. I haven't actually managed to read it yet, but I got it for Melinda. She was knocked out by it, and basically, hopefully, I'll get round to reading it when I get a little bit more spare time. But yeah, there are some wonderful people out there, but they're all on the margins. I don't think that anything of any real energy is happening at the centre of the comics industry.
Do you want to feel like you can carry on, I think?
What are we? It's about
26.
26. Okay, I might as well. Let's get to the end of this. Let's have a look. Do I need more tea? Yeah, I probably do, actually, Thompson. Thank you very much. Tea break. Let's have a look. 26. Obviously, you see some value in immortalising Harvey in a way that extends beyond the readers of his work. But it troubles me that we find it necessary to adopt a more canonised medium to communicate his legacy and to bring attention to Harvey's work. Aside from creating specific linkages to the classical art forms, how do we bring comics into the pantheon of accepted arts? Well, this is a question that I've been considering since very early in my career. I would say it is largely a problem for the pantheon of accepted arts. I don't think it's a problem for comics. I mean, very early on, when there was a fierce debate of can comics be art, I think that the stance that I always took was that it's just semantics, isn't it? There is not really a compelling fixed definition of what art is. So if you're talking about whether this can be accepted into the established pantheon of arts, I don't really much care about the established pantheon of arts. Say, for example, literature. The canon of great works of literature is largely based upon the critical response to the works of Jane Austen, who, while a great writer, she was the first person who managed to come up with the comedy of manners. Now, she was writing about middle-class people and their fascinating involved lives. This was a smart move because all of the critics belonged to that class, and they were flattered and delighted to find this woman writing about the intricacies of their lives and behaviour. Now, the problem was that they didn't just say Jane Austen and the comedy of manners is literature. They pretty much said Jane Austen and the comedy of manners is all of literature. And if you see stuff that talks about, you know, the canon of great literary works, they had a piece on British television, the, I don't know, 50 greatest literary novels of all time. And there was no mention of anything that even smacked of genre fiction, because that's not a middle-class comedy of manners. We can't have anything, there was Stein in there, even though it was a monumental book which arguably started the entire science fiction field. But that couldn't be included. They did include H.G. Wells, but it wasn't The Time Machine, it wasn't War of the Worlds or The Invisible Man or any of his genuinely wonderful apocalyptic science fiction writing. It was the history of Mr. Polly. One of the most, in my opinion, one of the most boring books that he ever wrote. If that is the literary canon, then neither I nor any of the writers that I'm interested in are very likely to be appearing in it. I would say that the established arts are overrated. I would say that if we look at the modern trend for conceptualism in gallery art, at least in this country, we've got a load of, in my opinion, fairly vacuous pieces that don't even have a concept at the core of them. They've got a kind of half an idea in the, but they're nothing that you're ever going to want to go back and look at again the way that you would with a work of genuine art. Once you've got the gag, then that's pretty much it. What I'm saying is that the accepted pantheon, I don't really think that it's worth bothering about. As far as I'm concerned, expressed in literature. So this is what it's about. This is, and believe me, Jerusalem is a more ambitious project than anything that I've ever attempted in comics. One of the precepts of Jerusalem was, right, what do I want to do? Right, I want to do a novel. What do I want it to be about? I want it to be about everything. I want it to be about everything in the world, or at least in my world. So that means talking about all of the people and the landscape that I grew up in, and upon the economic forces and the social forces that are acting upon that landscape, and the historical forces and the mythological forces and the fantasies that are in people's minds, and the residues of the past, and how all of this plays into this wonderful experience that we call existence. And I've tried to take existence, contemporary existence, in all of its aspects. This is probably, there's probably lots of things wrong with this novel, but lack of ambition is certainly not one of them. I feel that it is probably the most intense writing process that I've ever undertaken. So, no, I have got a publisher now, by the way. I've recently signed up to do it with Knockabout Palomano, which is the people who are publishing the league. So that will give me a bit of an incentive to get these last 5 chapters finished. And I'm hoping later in the year. But this will probably be the biggest work of my life. I certainly can't imagine myself ever doing anything more ambitious than this. So I don't think that I am getting more relaxed or casual about things or not as committed. I think it's just that my goals have shifted. I am doing things now which are probably a lot more difficult than doing a good superhero comic or even doing a good pornography. You know, is this the...
There's another question from the chat and there's something else.
Okay. The comics medium was once thought of by most people as only capable of producing near illiterate garbage. Yet you, Harvey, and many others prove that comics could be a great art form. What medium that is currently despised, for example, video games, professional wrestling, and so forth, by many people, would you say has the most artistic potential? Actually, I'm quite fond of the idea of professional wrestling as an art form with potential. I think I realised when I was a kid that it's theatre, isn't it? It's like Greek theatre with that strong pouring overhead light and the various wrestlers embodying obvious symbolic values. Yeah, this is the guy who is pretty but vain and evil, and this is the guy who is ugly but morally dependable. They're all acting out parts. So yes, I used to enjoy professional wrestling because I thought, well, this is theatre, nobody's getting hurt. Then I actually found out the kind of physical shape that professional wrestlers do actually end up in, because even if you're faking it all, when you're faking something that violent, yes, you are going to get incredibly hurt. So probably it's a nice idea, but I'd probably rule out professional wrestling. Now, in terms of media that are despised, I'd say some of the new high-tech media that are emerging. I am not sure what I could bring to the field of, say, computer games, because I am diametrically opposed. I'm violently hostile to the whole idea of the audience being able to control their own adventures. I am a real fascist when it comes to narrative. I don't think that the person enjoying the story should be allowed to choose how it's going to end. If that was the case, then everyone would have voted for Charles Dickens not to kill Little Nell at the end of the Old Curiosity Shop. The thing is, Dickens knows better than you. That's why he's Dickens. And so really, but when I read a story, I don't want to impose my preferences. Oh, I hope that the author ends it this way. Oh, I hope that Titus manages to get home at the end of Titus Alone and it's all right again like it was in the first two books. No, that wasn't what Mervyn Peake was trying to convey. The reason I was reading Mervyn Peake was because I was interested in what he wanted to convey. So I wouldn't be happy with choose your own adventure, or it's just nothing that I could. I'm not saying that there couldn't be great games done, but I don't really feel comfortable with that. I like to provide a narrative that starts and has a middle and has a certain specific ending, which you could probably read as a comment upon these Watchmen prequels that I noticed that everybody was so nervous about mentioning when I was just looking through the text before we started all this. Certain things are meant to simply have a finite length and a finite ending to them, and they're meant to be one way and not another. And so I would say that probably that area, no, I wouldn't be that interested in that. There are some bits of emergent technology that I do find quite interesting. I mean, the mobile phone apps, and I should stress again that I do not own a mobile phone, and I've only got the sketchiest idea of what an app is. But reading in New Scientist, they did a piece upon 10 disruptive technologies that will definitely be appearing during the next 10 years. And one of these was the what did they call it? It was basically using apps to transform the environment, to transform the urban environment. That those little symbols that you can view through your cell phone, which can trigger off all sorts of augmented reality. There were people talking about the augmented city. This would be where you have these little ciphers actually embedded in buildings or landmarks. Now, this is interesting. Yes, it will be used as advertising and it will be used as a gimmick. But potentially what you've got there is a way of embedding the information concerning a thing directly into the thing itself, where you could make buildings actually repositories of all the information that has ever occurred within that building. It could actually transform the environment we live in so that it wasn't just a fascinating environment if you happen to be an elderly psychogeographer who just happens to know everything about what's happened upon every street corner just because he's got hundreds and hundreds of rare old books. You could just be somebody ordinary and you could interact with your environment in the way that people like me or people like Ian Sinclair interact with their environments. It would change what landscape meant. Now, can I think of any obvious artistic applications of that? Not at the moment. But there's got to be something there, hasn't there? So that's one of the things that I should be keeping my eye on, how that kind of technology progresses and the kind of potential that it opens up. So.
Right, there's one, yeah.
One more?
There's one question from chat, which is, how much research went into From Hell? Did you really spend 8 years researching it before you started to write it?
No, I didn't. I was producing it at the time in serialized form for Steve Bissett's Taboo magazine. And I knew that was coming up, and so yes, we needed the first episode within a few weeks, or at least I had to be starting upon it. Now, I had been interested in the Whitechapel murders for a number of years. I was surprised when my mother died and we were cleaning out some of the junk in her council house, and we found in the room that used to be my room, we found a suitcase full of papers and rubbish, including some stuff that I'd obviously saved, an article in, I think, the Daily Mirror or the Sunday Mirror, about the Jack the Ripper murders. So I'd forgotten completely all about that, but I must have had an interest. Not an unhealthy interest, I hope, but I had an interest from an early age. And I was starting to think about the idea of a murder as a suitable subject for a fictional investigation, for a kind of an autopsy. It was difficult at first finding the right murder, but during the autumn of 1988, when it was the centenary of the Whitechapel murders, there were lots of things appearing on television, including a not particularly good TV movie starring Michael Caine, which nevertheless relied heavily upon Stephen Knight's book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, which I hadn't read at that point. But reading it, I suddenly saw that in some of the frankly bizarre speculations that Knight had included in his book, how this kind of opened up the Jack the Ripper narrative into something that potentially touched upon all these fascinating areas. And so I started by reading Knight's book, and then I thought, right, I want to read, this gives me at least an outline for the basic narrative. But I want to read all the other books about Jack the Ripper so that I can come at this from as multi-dimensional angle as possible, so that I can include as many of the theories as possible within one coherent narrative. And so I was reading all of these Ripper books, most of them, some of them very good, some of them very good, some of them absolutely appalling, some of them a complete waste of time. All of them interesting, if only in a pathological sense. But I'd already become very interested in research doing Brought to Light, which again was a huge amount of research which I had to digest very quickly and then to assimilate into the work that eventually emerged. And the same was true with From Hell. That Brought to Light had given me a bit of a taste for research. I found it really interesting, and I can do it quite quick. You just have to spend a few days not leaving your room and just reading book after book, making little notes, seeing correspondences, how a certain fact will present an idea for a scene. And it took me 10 years to complete work upon From Hell, and I was still probably researching elements of it right up until we finished the second appendix, Dance of the Gold Catchers. So yes, it was a 10-year research process, but it was done on the hoof. It was done while I was actually working. I'd got enough of the story worked out roughly so that as new details emerged from the research, I'd left myself enough space to fit it in to the narrative. I'd got the broad shape of the narrative established very early on, and then filled in the details as I went along. And yeah, that's pretty much how it worked with From Hell.
Right. Should we wrap things up and remind everybody why we're doing this?
That's probably a good idea. Let me see. I've got some things here about Bumper Book of Magic. I'll just answer that one, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah, the bumper book. Hopefully, it will do just what it says on the cover. It's an enjoyable book. It's hopefully going to be presented as if it's a big, lovely children's book. But of course, it's very, very adult. We're just lying with the presentation. But we've got everything in there. We've got theoretical articles that should give people a framework for understanding the terms that we're talking in and how this stuff is practically applicable. How you can use these ideas, hopefully, to enhance your life and the lives of those around you. We have got a fantastic reading of the history of magic in these Lives of the Great Enchanters pages that are spaced throughout the book. And me and Steve have come up with some information while researching those that frankly surprised us. We found out who Faust was and how the story came to be, how the Faust of legend was a conflation of two real people, Georgius Sibyllicus Faustus Secundus, who was a paedophile, a diabolist, not a very nice man, but he got confused with Johannes Faust, who was a theological scholar at Gothenburg. But because they got the same name, they both got confused as the same person. And then added to the Faust story was the biblical story of Simon Magus, of Simon the Magician. They took elements of that and added them to the Faust story, and we've managed to trace all of these various strands back to their origins. Very satisfying. We've found out quite a lot of things that surprised us. Like I was saying earlier, it does progress very slowly, but by the end of it, I'm hoping that somebody who reads it and sticks with it will have an understanding of what magic is, some suggestions as to how you might approach it, how to get yourself into the magical state, what to do once you're there, experiments you might like to try, the history of people who've tried them before you and have ended up as gibbering lunatics, and some interesting little bits of decadent magical pulp fiction that are spaced throughout the narrative as well, and some very funny little Kevin O'Neill one-pagers giving the life of Alexander of Abonoticus, who was the creator of Glycon, my personal snake deity. So there's bits of it which are very beautiful, there's bits of it which are profound, there's bits of it which are very funny, which is pretty much a reflection of what I find magic to be. So don't know how long you've got to wait for that. Like I say, it's only done when me and Steve get together, but we're about halfway through, 2/3 of the way through. It'll be worth it when it's finally there. Right, well, that would seem to be all we've got time for, because I don't actually live here. You know, as I was saying earlier, I am currently in debtor's prison and I'm only on day release. So I have to let Joe and Thompson go to bed at some point. And I've got Melinda waiting for me at home. So I'd like to thank all of you, for taking part in this evening. It's very flattering to think that so many people wanted to talk to me, and I'd especially like to thank you for donating to this memorial to Harvey. I think that is incredible, and it's a really reassuring sign that there's people out there who care enough about this kind of thing, and that much as I despise the internet and don't want any part of it, I mean, I've got nothing against anybody else taking part in cybernetic culture. It's just not for me. But when I see something like this, which is enabling a project like this to happen, then yeah, I probably won't be going online anytime soon, but it does give me a greater appreciation of the kind of possibilities that this world apparently has these days. So it's been great talking to you. They were some very intelligent questions, and I did notice there was one question from the long list that I read earlier, which was saying, how much do you hate doing this right now? Isn't having even a little bit of fame a real drag? Isn't it horrible? Yeah, obviously, depending upon how you deal with fame, it can be a problem. But no, I don't hate doing this right now. I'm really glad to be doing this right now, because it means a lot to me to be able to do this for Harvey and for Joyce. You know, two people who I love very dearly. So sort of, no, I don't hate this at all. And there were some very interesting questions, and I enjoyed answering all of them. And you know, maybe in the future we can do this again sometime, assuming that you're not all bored of me after this probably sort of endurance testing couple of hours. You know, but thank you all for dropping in. Thank you all for talking to me, and thank